To rule the broken is not to celebrate cruelty, but to understand a quiet truth about human nature that Machiavelli observed without sentimentality or illusion. He did not romanticize people as purely rational actors guided by reasoned self-interest. Instead, he saw them as emotionally driven beings, shaped by invisible fractures formed through fear, loss, disappointment, and unmet longing. People who are inwardly fractured do not move by reason alone, and often reason plays only a minor role in their decisions. They move by hunger, not merely physical hunger, but emotional and existential hunger, by fear of chaos and abandonment, by hope for relief, and by a deep longing to be held together by something stronger than themselves. When inner order collapses, when the mind and identity no longer feel coherent, the desire for external order intensifies dramatically. Authority becomes attractive not because it is fair, moral, or even beneficial, but because it feels stabilizing. It offers a framework where there was confusion, a spine where there was collapse. In such conditions, people do not ask whether authority is just. They ask whether it can hold them. Machiavelli recognized that power often rises not in moments of collective strength, but in moments of widespread psychological disarray. Brokenness creates a vacuum, and authority rushes in to fill it, not as a moral savior, but as an organizing force that promises relief from inner chaos. Brokenness is not always visible, and this is what makes it such a powerful political and psychological force. It rarely announces itself openly. More often it hides behind smiles that are too eager, loyalty that is too loud, and declarations of belief that feel rehearsed rather than rooted. The most fractured individuals are frequently the most eager followers, not because they are foolish, but because obedience offers them relief from the exhausting burden of self-direction. To decide for oneself requires inner coherence, confidence, and tolerance for uncertainty, all of which broken people lack. Machiavelli understood that many people would rather surrender freedom than endure the anxiety that comes with responsibility. Freedom demands accountability for failure, while obedience allows failure to be blamed on authority. This trade is rarely conscious, yet it is deeply felt. To rule such people is first to recognize this silent exchange taking place beneath the surface, freedom traded for psychological shelter. The ruler who misunderstands this will mistake obedience for loyalty and stability for health. In reality, obedience is often a coping mechanism, a way to avoid confronting inner fragmentation. The broken do not seek chains, they seek relief. And if chains provide that relief, they will accept them willingly, even gratefully. Power over the broken does not begin with commands, threats, or visible force. It begins with interpretation. Whoever names the chaos gives it shape, and shape brings comfort. When people cannot explain their own suffering, when their pain feels random, meaningless, or humiliating, they instinctively look outward for someone who can give it a story. A narrative transforms pain from something endured into something justified. Machiavelli understood that the ruler who provides a convincing explanation for suffering becomes indispensable, not because the explanation is true, but because it is stabilizing. Meaning binds more tightly than force ever could. A soldier who believes his suffering serves a purpose will endure far more than one who believes it is pointless. The same applies to civilians under authority. Once chaos is named, once suffering is framed as necessary, temporary, or noble, resistance weakens. People do not rebel against pain when they believe it has meaning. They rebel when pain feels arbitrary. Interpretation then becomes a subtle form of dominion. The ruler does not need to eliminate suffering, he needs to explain it. In doing so, he positions himself not merely as a governor of bodies, but as a curator of meaning, shaping how people understand their own lives. Fear alone is a blunt instrument. It can bend behavior in the short term, but it cannot hold loyalty for long, especially among those already fractured. The broken already live with fear, fear of abandonment, fear of insignificance, fear of disorder, fear of being exposed as inadequate. To add more fear without direction only deepens instability. Machiavelli would argue that effective rule does not seek to eliminate fear, nor does it rely on raw terror alone. Instead, it channels fear into something usable. Redirected fear becomes devotion when people fear losing belonging. It becomes discipline when they fear falling outside the structure. It becomes obedience when fear is framed as protection. Fear given a purpose transforms from paralysis into motivation. The broken do not need to be frightened, they already are. What they need is a framework that tells them where fear belongs and how it can be managed. A ruler who understands this will never rule by chaos alone. He will offer rules, enemies, standards, and rituals that give fear direction. In this way, fear becomes productive, reinforcing the very system that claims to contain it. Machiavelli would remind us that mercy without structure breeds contempt, especially among the broken. Compassion that lacks boundaries is interpreted not as kindness, but as weakness. The broken do not respect softness. They consume it, because consumption feels like survival. When aid is given without expectation, without discipline, without transformation, it reinforces dependency rather than stability. The ruler who rescues without requiring change does not create loyalty, he creates resentment. Dependency may feel like control in the short term, but it is fragile and volatile. Those who depend most intensely often harbor the deepest bitterness, because dependence humiliates even as it comforts. Machiavelli did not argue against mercy itself. He warned against mercy that undermines authority. Compassion must be administered with structure, expectation, and consequence, or it dissolves power rather than strengthening it. For the broken, boundaries are not cruelty, they are containment. Without containment, mercy becomes chaotic, and chaos is the very condition authority exists to suppress. Order is the true sedative for fractured minds. When rules are clear, consequences predictable, and hierarchies visible, the broken feel safe even as they complain. Complaints, in this context, are not rebellion. They are reassurance. They signal that the structure still exists, that someone is listening, that the system has not collapsed into silence. Machiavelli understood that chaos terrifies more than oppression ever could. An oppressive system at least offers consistency. An unstable one offers nothing. This is why people endure harsh systems far longer than unstable ones. Stability becomes a form of psychological shelter. Even suffering becomes tolerable when it is familiar. The broken prefer a painful order to a painless uncertainty. A ruler who provides structure, even strict structure, becomes associated with safety, not cruelty. This is the paradox of power over the broken. The same system that limits them also comforts them. Remove the system, and anxiety rushes in to fill the void. To rule the broken, one must understand the psychology of hope, which is far more subtle than optimism. Hope does not need to be fulfilled to be effective. It needs to be believable. A promise placed just far enough in the future governs behavior more effectively than an immediate reward. Machiavelli saw that when people believe tomorrow depends on obedience today, they regulate themselves without force. Hope becomes a leash made of possibility. The broken cling to hope because it offers escape without requiring immediate change. It allows suffering to be endured rather than confronted. A distant promise keeps people invested in the system, even when the present is painful. Fulfilled hope ends its usefulness. Unfulfilled but plausible hope renews itself endlessly. This is why rulers often promise progress rather than deliver completion. As long as people believe improvement is coming, they tolerate what they would otherwise resist. Hope, skillfully managed, becomes one of the most powerful tools of governance. especially over those whose inner lives are too fractured to sustain themselves without it. Identity is another lever of power, and for the broken it is perhaps the most decisive one. Those who are inwardly fractured often lack a stable sense of self, not because they are unintelligent or weak, but because their inner narratives are inconsistent, interrupted by doubt, shame, or unresolved conflict. In this vacuum, borrowed identities become lifelines. Nation, religion, ideology, movement, or leader becomes a mirror in which they finally recognize themselves as whole. Machiavelli observed that when people cannot define who they are, they cling fiercely to symbols that tell them who they belong to. Identity adopted under such conditions is not casual, it is total. Once power fuses itself with identity, dissent no longer feels like disagreement. It feels like self-annihilation. To oppose the ruler becomes to betray oneself, one's community, and one's meaning. This is why identity-based loyalty is so enduring. It does not rely on constant enforcement, because the individual becomes the enforcer. The broken defend the system with intensity precisely because the system has given them a self. To strip that away would reopen the fracture they fear most. Shame is more potent than punishment, because punishment ends while shame lingers and multiplies internally. Machiavelli understood that the most effective forms of control are those that continue operating even when authority is absent. A ruler who defines what is honorable and what is disgraceful governs behavior through internalized judgment rather than external force. The broken are especially vulnerable to shame because they already carry an underlying sense of inadequacy. Social exclusion, ridicule, or moral condemnation wounds them more deeply than physical threat ever could. Shame isolates, and isolation intensifies dependence on the system that defines belonging. Once shame is established as a regulatory force, people police themselves and each other. They fear not just punishment, but being seen, labeled, and cast out. This form of control is efficient and subtle. It rarely needs to be enforced directly. The broken learn quickly what earns approval and what invites humiliation. Over time, they no longer need the ruler's presence to conform. Shame has been successfully installed as an inner governor. Yet there is danger in ruling exclusively through fracture. Power sustained purely by manipulation eventually hollows itself out. When people are ruled only as broken, they never heal, and unhealed masses are volatile. Machiavelli did not advocate blind cruelty or endless degradation. He warned against instability above all else. A population kept perpetually wounded becomes unpredictable, prone to sudden eruptions of resentment or collapse. Fracture can be used, but it must be managed. The ruler must decide how much brokenness to preserve and how much to repair. Too much fracture leads to decay. Too much repair leads to independence. This balance is delicate and often misunderstood. Stability requires a controlled degree of strength among the ruled, enough to function, but not enough to escape. Machiavelli's realism lies here. Power is not about maximizing suffering, but about maintaining order. An authority that ignores the long-term consequences of psychological damage eventually undermines itself. Repair, however, does not mean liberation. It does not mean encouraging people to become fully autonomous or self-determining. It means selective strengthening. Teach discipline, not independence. Teach competence, not imagination beyond the system. Machiavelli recognized that a population capable of functioning within a structure, yet unable to envision life outside it, represents the ideal balance between strength and control. Such people are productive, resilient, and orderly, but their horizons remain bounded. They can solve problems without questioning the framework that defines those problems. Repair, in this sense, is strategic. It reinforces the system rather than threatening it. The ruler who understands this invests in skills that increase efficiency while limiting philosophical freedom. The broken are healed just enough to serve, but not enough to transcend. Ritual plays a crucial role in sustaining this balance. Repetition calms the anxious mind and reduces cognitive strain. Ceremonies, routines, symbols, and scheduled observances anchor people in time and place, providing predictability where inner coherence is lacking. For the broken, ritual substitutes for internal stability. It becomes a borrowed spine, a rhythm that organizes emotion and attention. Machiavelli understood that ritual does not need to be meaningful to be effective. It needs to be consistent. Through repetition, obedience becomes habit, and habit becomes identity. The ruler who controls ritual controls emotional rhythm, shaping when people feel pride, fear, unity, or submission. Over time, ritual embeds authority into daily life, making power feel natural rather than imposed. The system no longer feels external, it feels inevitable. Language itself becomes an instrument of rule when addressing fractured minds. Simplified slogans outperform complex truths because complexity demands inner stability and critical patience. Nuance introduces ambiguity, and ambiguity produces anxiety. Certainty, even when false, creates comfort. Machiavelli recognized that clarity is persuasive precisely because it eliminates the burden of interpretation. When people are broken, they do not want to think deeply, they want to feel grounded. Slogans compress reality into manageable forms. They reduce doubt and offer instant orientation. Over time, language reshapes perception. What can be spoken becomes what can be thought. The ruler who controls language narrows the range of acceptable ideas, not through censorship alone, but through repetition and framing. Fractured minds adapt quickly to simplified realities because simplicity feels safe. The ruler must remain partially distant to sustain authority. Familiarity erodes mystique, and mystique sustains power. The broken project strength, wisdom, and stability onto what they cannot fully access. Distance allows imagination to amplify authority beyond its actual substance. Machiavelli understood that mystery invites reverence. However, distance must be balanced with occasional visibility. A rare appearance reassures the masses that the structure is real, that the order they rely on has a living center. Presence used sparingly becomes powerful. Constant presence becomes ordinary, and ordinariness dissolves authority. The broken need to believe in something larger than themselves, and that belief requires space for projection. The ruler who masters distance governs not only actions, but perception. Conflict can be useful if it is carefully managed and deliberately framed. Machiavelli understood that internal fracture seeks an outlet, and without direction it turns inward, producing dissent, apathy, or decay. External enemies provide focus. When people are divided within themselves, they crave a common threat that allows them to redirect their anxiety and aggression outward. Conflict simplifies reality. It creates a clear boundary between us and them, relieving individuals of the burden of inner contradiction. Whether the enemy is real, exaggerated, or symbolic matters less than its emotional usefulness. War, competition, ideological struggle, or moral panic all serve the same function. They unify fragmented identities under a shared cause. The broken feel whole when they are aligned against something. Machiavelli recognized that loyalty intensifies under perceived threat. Fear of the external enemy strengthens attachment to internal order. Conflict, when controlled, consolidates power by transforming private insecurity into collective purpose. Without an enemy, fractured societies turn on themselves. With one, they march together. Yet the most enduring form of rule is not enforced externally, but internalized quietly. When people begin to enforce the ruler's values upon themselves and upon one another, power has reached its highest efficiency. At this stage, authority no longer needs constant surveillance or punishment. Habits have replaced commands. Norms have replaced laws. The broken become custodians of the system that contains them, defending it instinctively because it has become inseparable from their sense of order. Machiavelli saw that this internalization marks the transition from fragile dominance to lasting control. When people correct each other, shame dissent, and reward conformity on behalf of power, the ruler governs without appearing to govern. The system perpetuates itself through social pressure and internal discipline. This is the quiet triumph of authority, when obedience feels voluntary and resistance feels unnatural. There is, however, a moral tension here that Machiavelli never fully resolved. To rule the broken is to benefit from their wounds, whether intentionally or not. Stability achieved through fracture raises uncomfortable questions about responsibility and ethics. Is order legitimate when it relies on unhealed pain? Is peace meaningful if it depends on suppressed autonomy? Machiavelli observed these dynamics without pretending they were virtuous. He understood that philosophy lingers where politics often refuses to look. Power seeks results, not moral clarity. Yet unresolved fracture accumulates beneath the surface. Even when order appears stable, suppressed wounds shape the emotional landscape of society. The ruler must live with this tension, knowing that every system built on brokenness carries a hidden cost that may surface unpredictably. History shows repeatedly that power rarely waits for healing. It moves toward opportunity, not readiness. Brokenness creates openings, and openings invite rulers. Periods of social, economic, or psychological collapse are rarely followed by collective enlightenment. They are followed by authority. Machiavelli recognized that those who hesitate in moments of fracture are replaced by those who act decisively. The question, then, is not whether power will exploit brokenness, but how consciously it will be done. Will it be crude and destabilizing or calculated and sustaining? Power does not ask whether people are whole. It asks whether they are governable, and fractured populations yearning for coherence often are. In the end, to rule the broken is to walk a narrow path between order and decay. Too much pressure shatters what remains, producing rebellion or collapse. Too much freedom dissolves structure, returning people to the chaos they fear. Machiavelli's lesson is not a celebration of cruelty, but a warning about imbalance. Authority that ignores the psychology of fracture becomes blind. Authority that exploits it without restraint becomes brittle. The ruler must continuously adjust, reinforcing structure while preventing total disintegration. This balance is not moral, it is practical. It is the art of sustaining power over unstable human material without triggering its destruction. Machiavelli's final insight lingers beneath all others. Understand the fractures of the human soul, or they will govern you instead. Power does not float above psychology, it is rooted in it. Those who rule without understanding brokenness are ruled by its consequences. Those who understand it can shape order from chaos, stability from fear, and loyalty from longing. This is not an endorsement of domination, but an acknowledgement of reality. Human beings do not arrive whole into political systems. They arrive wounded, uncertain, and searching for coherence. Power fills that search. The danger lies not in recognizing this truth, but in forgetting its cost. This is the Golden Circle Philosophy channel. Like the video, share it with a friend, and subscribe for more videos like this one. Thank you for watching.